Hello people and happy Sunday. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, then consider subscribing because I release weekly free content to help you guys improve your English video by video. This week's topic is going to be what we call in English the passive voice versus the active voice. Now, the passive and the active voice are two different sentence forms to describe the exact same thing. Now you might think, well, what's the point? And I would kind of see where you was coming from with that statement, because you can communicate with people without ever using the passive voice, but there are some instances or situations where using the passive voice can be beneficial to your English. But before we get into that, let's look at the form and the difference between the active voice and the passive voice. And to do this, I'm going to use a pen and a piece of paper. Let's get into it. Okay, so I've written down an example sentence here. And the sentence is, Gino recorded this video. Now this sentence at the top is in the active voice and it is in the past simple tense. So you can see that we have the subject at the beginning of the sentence, which in this case is me, Gino. Then we have the verb, recorded, and then we have the object, which is this video. Now to change this into the passive voice, we bring the video from being the object into being the subject of the sentence. So this video. Then we need to add the verb to be. Now, we also need to consider the conjugation of the verb to be depending on the tense of the active voice phrase. So we know that this is the past simple. So in this case, the verb to be will be was. So this video was, then the active verb from the active voice phrase will always be in the past participle. There is no deviating from that rule. It is always the past participle of the verb. So this video, the verb to be, which in this case is was, past participle of the verb recorded, which is recorded, and then in this instance, by Gino, we call this the agent. So what was the subject here has now become the agent, whereas in the active voice we call it the object. Okay, so that is the basic format or the basic form of the passive voice tense. And at this point I just want to mention that we can only use this passive voice with transitive verbs. We cannot use it with intransitive verbs. Now, intransitive verbs generally describe physical behaviour, so they don't have an object. For example, the sentence, she is sleeping. We could not transform that into a passive voice because there's nothing to switch. There's nothing to switch into the subject, if you understand where I'm coming from. Now let's go through some of the reasons that we might prefer to use the passive voice form of a sentence. And the first one is to shift the focus of the sentence. So to make the subject something else. So it shifts the focus. I'll give you an example of that right now. So I'm going to use the same sentence to give you an example of how this shifts the focus. So you can see that in this sentence, the focus is on the subject, which is me. So Gino recorded this video. So that is the most important part of the sentence. Whereas if I want to put all the focus on the video to make the video the subject of the sentence, I would say, this video was recorded by Gino. So all the other information that comes after it is not as important as the video. And it just switches the attention of the reader or the listener to this particular part of the sentence, which is the video. Okay, moving on. And the second way that I can think of in which we use the passive voice is when we don't know who did the action, when we don't know who did it. And I'm going to give you an example of that on the piece of paper. Okay, to give you an example of how we might prefer to use the passive voice when we don't know who did the action, I've wrote the same phrase but in the two different forms. So this is the active, this is the passive. So the active is somebody has broken the window. Now to change this into the passive, obviously the window, which is the object in this sentence, is now the subject in the sentence below. So the window has been. So we need to add the verb to be and conjugate it. This tense here is the present perfect. So we need to conjugate it into has been. So the window has been broken. Now you could say by somebody on the end, but it isn't necessary. You could simply say the window has been broken because we don't know who did it. Okay, and the third way that I can think of where we use the passive voice is when it's not important who's doing the action or who did the action. And to give you an example of that, let's go back to the paper. And to give an example how we might prefer to use the passive voice when it is not important who performed the action or who is doing the action, we have two sentences. The first one is in the active voice, which is someone is collecting me, and this is in the present continuous tense. So to make this into the passive, we would say I'm being collected. So we've added the verb to be in the right conjugation to the tense of this phrase. And then obviously the active verb is always the past participle. So I'm being collected is the passive version of someone is collecting me. Now, as before, we could add by somebody on the end, but it isn't necessary. And the fourth situation in which I can think of where you might prefer to use the passive voice is when it is obvious who did the action or who performed the action. And to give you an example of that, let's go back to the paper. To give you an example of how you might prefer to use the passive voice when it is obvious who performed the action, we have here in the active voice, the policeman arrested John. Now, to turn this into the passive voice, we would put John as the subject. So John plus the verb to be, which we've conjugated to the past simple. So John was, and then we have the past participle of the active verb. John was arrested. There's no need to say by the policeman because it's obvious. There's only policemen who arrest people. Okay guys, almost there, just two more to do. The fifth situation I can think of in which you might prefer to use the passive is to avoid assigning responsibility for the action. So let's give you an example of that. And this is how we could use the passive voice to avoid assigning responsibility to the action. So you can see here I have two sentences again. And the first one, which is in the active voice, is John made a mistake. So if you can imagine that your boss is asking you why something happened at work that he isn't very happy about, and you don't want to drop John in it, then you could say a mistake was made. This is the passive form because we've made the mistake the subject, we've added the verb to be, and as always, the active verb is the past participle. No need to say John because we're trying not to assign responsibility. Okay, and situation number 6, which happens to be the last one for today, is you might prefer to use the passive voice to improve your sentence flow, either written or spoken. And to give you an example, let's go back to the paper. All right, so to give you an example of how the passive voice can be used to improve the overall sentence flow, I've wrote out two little paragraphs here to give you a demonstration. So in the first one you can see, Gino recorded this video. He did it in half an hour. He edited the video. He uploaded the video. So Gino did this, then he did that, then he did that, then he did that. Can you see how, although this is grammatically correct, it can be very boring? So to give it improved flow, we could switch the two around. So we could say, This video was recorded by Gino. He did it in half an hour. The video was edited and uploaded. So can you see by how mixing the active and the passive voice, the sentence has more fluidity and it's not quite as boring to listen to or to read. Okay, so that is it for this week's video. This week I took a break from the normal stuff that I do, which is real-time examples, to do this topic, which was actually suggested by a subscriber. So I wanted to honour some of them suggestions. I have a few more suggestions which I'm going to make videos on too. So if you have any ideas on future videos, then please let me know and I'll do my best to try and make some content to help you learn. Having said that, enjoy the rest of your weekend and I'll see you people in the next video. Bye bye people. Ciao.